Hey everybody, welcome back to another Web Dev Junkie video. My name is Cody Seibert, and in this video I'm going to show you how to build a suggestions component using React.js. So if you're not familiar with what a suggestions component is, it's basically an input box that when you start typing into it, it'll give you some suggestions that match the input that you've typed in. So for an example, I have a list of different, fruits set up as things you can search for. And if I type in something like APE, you'll notice that grapes come back. But if I type in like ES, I get a bunch of other suggestions such as apples, oranges, and grapes. So when I click on one of these, basically it's going to set your input box equal to the suggestion that you clicked. And then you could also add a hook or some type of callback to go ahead and do your search when you click on a suggestion, or just click here and do a suggestion search. So if you're new to programming or new to React, I do think you should stick around and watch this full tutorial because there's a lot of cool things that we're going to be covering in this video. So to go ahead and get started, I use Create React App to build out this project structure, and we're just going to go ahead and open up the app.js and kind of set it to an empty file just to start playing around with. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a suggestions component, which is going to basically encapsulate all this logic for us. So I'm going to go in the source folder and create a new file called suggestions.js, and I'm going to go ahead and scaffold out a React functional component here. And before I start implementing anything inside this component, what we want to do is we want to import it inside of our app.js so that we can use it. So I'm going to go ahead and say open caret suggestions and then close caret and make sure I auto import that. Go ahead and get rid of logo because we're not using that. So to verify this is working, I'm just going to go ahead and put hello inside of this component to make sure that this React component is indeed being imported and rendered out correctly. And you'll notice here that it is. So at this point, let's just think about what a suggestions component is. It's basically an input box, a button that you can search with, and then finally a div that shows all the suggestions that you can click on. Let's go ahead and try to build that out. So I'm going to first build an input box. I'm going to build a button that has search as some text, and then I'm going to make a div with the class name of suggestions. And let's just go ahead and see what this gives us. You can see here we have an input box, we have a button, and then somewhere on the page there's a hidden div with probably no width or height. So before I start implementing any type of logic for this component, I'm just going to go ahead and create a suggestion CSS file so we can start applying some basic styles to this component. So inside my source folder, I'm going to make a suggestions.css file, and I'm going to go ahead and make sure I import that here inside of this component. So now that I do that, I have the ability to start writing some styles in this file, which will be applied to my application. And note that you can use like style components or you can use inline CSS. The choice is really yours. I'm just doing this because it's easiest for me. So at this point, what we could do is we could apply some padding and maybe a little bit of font size to the input and the button. I'm going to say input and button. I'm going to say padding is 4 pixels and font size is 20 pixels. And now after doing that, we need to figure out how to show this suggestions div. So right now, if I make some styles on the suggestions div, I could give it a background color of blue just to kind of demonstrate. Maybe a fixed width of 300 and a height of 200. Let's just go ahead and see where that gets positioned. You'll notice here it gets pushed all the way to the left of the page, but what we want to do is position it directly to the left of this input box. So one trick you can do is inside of the suggestions component, this top level div, the parent div, I could give a class called wrapper, and I could style that wrapper to be a display of inline block. And after doing that, you'll notice that this gets positioned more to the right. And then secondly, what I could do is give this a position of absolute. Now there's a lot of other ways you could probably achieve this, but this is the way that I did it in this tutorial. So if you have any suggestions about better ways, feel free to leave a comment below. So now that we have some basic styling working on this component, let's just go ahead and start implementing a little bit of the logic. So if I go back to my suggestions component, what I could do is create some type of state to keep track of when the user inputted something into this text field. So let's just go ahead and use the useState hook, and that's going to return us an array. And the first argument I'm going to denote as our search field. And the second argument is a setter function you can use, so set search field. And that is going to be equal to a function called useState, which I will set equal to the empty string. Now make sure I auto import this from React. Let me go ahead and do that up here. For some reason my auto importing is not working, so I'll just do it manually. And what we want to do is basically when the user types into the input box, we want to make sure that we update this state value. Okay, so in order to do that, on the input element itself, we could say on change, and we can have that invoke an anonymous function which calls set search field of e.target.value. So now as I type into this input box, we're going to be updating this state variable. And to kind of demonstrate that, what I could do is I could go to my go to my Chrome DevTools down here, and I have a React Redux toolkit installed, or whatever it's called. And if I click on components, I can click on suggestions and get more info into what the state is. So in this case, let me zoom in a little bit. The state is an empty string, and as I type into this input box, notice that the state is updated as I type. Now I don't know why there's two suggestions. Maybe I accidentally did that twice. Let me just do a hard refresh. Okay, so this plugin was a little bit broken, but all right. So now when the user types into this input box, we want to basically filter out a list of suggestions and show them in this drop down here. So let's just go ahead and get rid of that blue color and instead give it like a box shadow. So I can give it 1 pixel, and give it some darker color. Let me give it 3 pixels. All right, so that doesn't look too bad. But before I go further, let's just make the body something a little bit more gray. So I'm going to give it something like this. And the suggestions component can have a background color of white. All right, there we go. So that looks a little bit better. So what we're going to do next is as the user types into this input box, we want to pretend like we're making some type of request to a backend and then show a list of suggestions that that backend gives back to us. So what we could do is I'm going to make a new file called api.js. And this api.js file is going to export a const called getSuggestions. And that is going to be a function that takes in an argument of, I'll say search text, I guess. And we could, for right now, just hard code it to return a list of 3 fruits. So I'll say apples, oranges, and grapes. Okay. So we have a function that returns these. And what we could do in our suggestions component is import that API function. Import getSuggestions from API. And then we can invoke it whenever someone searches into the search field to get back a list of all the suggestions. So how do we do a request when someone types into this search field? Well, we already have an onChange listener here. So one thing we could do is basically just use an effect and listen to search field. And then as it changes, we can get a list of new suggestions. So I'm going to go ahead and use the useEffect function. And if someone types into this, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this. Let me empty all this out so it's not so confusing. So if you haven't used the useEffect hook before, basically it's a watcher. So you can tell it to watch on certain variables. And if they change, you can invoke a function. So I'm going to go here and say, if search field ever updates, I'm going to go ahead and call getSuggestions, and I'm going to pass it search field. And then at that point, this should return us some JSON, which will be an array of suggestions, and we need to put that somewhere. So right now, if you know anything about promise chaining, you could just do a .then, and that will have a list of all of your suggestions. So I'm going to go ahead and call that suggestions, and then I'm going to have a function to set those. So in order to have those show up in the UI, what we need to do is basically loop over them, right? So I think I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to just go ahead and make sure I import that so that we no longer have errors here. And then we want a state variable to basically, oh, it's complaining. We want to make this async to pretend like it's an asynchronous call. So I'm going to go ahead and put the async keyword on that. And now when we get that list of suggestions back, I'll just go ahead and print that out for you so we can see that it returns an array of 3. And I'll go to the network console. So as I type stuff in, we get our list of suggestions, and right now it's hard-coded to 3 things, but we can change that later. But what we're going to do is we want to show those inside of this suggestions div, right? So in order to do that, we're going to have another state variable. So I'm going to copy this and say suggestions and set suggestions. And that is going to be a state variable that has an empty array. So I'm going to, since we have some duplicate naming here, I'm going to go ahead and call that found suggestions. And what we can do is instead of console logging here, we could call the set suggestions function and pass it all the suggestions that we just found. So now as we type into this input box, it's going to be updating the state variable, and then we can render them out. So the next step is, how do you render them out to this div? Well, I can go down here and just map over them. So I'll have this return a function that has a div, and that could just have a suggestion that prints out. So right now, you will see that it just prints out apples, oranges, and grapes, and that is because this text field, when this component mounts, is going to basically do a search, because the search field is an empty string by default. So we probably want to just return if this is equal to an empty array and not actually do a search. So if I refresh the page, we don't have any suggestions. If I type in a single thing, I'll get back a list of suggestions. And we are getting a complaint down here saying that we need a key on this. So if I go over here and add a key, I'll just go ahead and put suggestion as that key, and that'll get rid of that React error for us. Or I guess it's more of a warning. So at this point, it doesn't really make sense to just hard code a list of things, even if they don't match what you're passing in. So let's just go ahead and go back to the API code, and we're going to make this a little bit more realistic. So instead, let's just have a list of, I'll say, fruits, and we can pull out these fruits here. And instead of just returning a hard-coded list of fruits, what we want to do is return a filter on those and make sure that the fruit matches whatever substring that you're passing in. So I'm going to say fruits.filter, and we want to make sure that the fruit has something relevant to what we're searching for. So I'm going to say index of search text is not equal to -1. So now as I search, I could just type in, I'll do like oranges, so R-A-N-G, and notice that oranges show up, and as I backspace, grapes will come up, and apples and whatnot. So we could add a couple more things here. So bananas, cherry, blackberry, raspberry. I don't know if I spelled that right. But anyway, you get the idea. Now I have a larger list of fruits, and as I'm typing in here, certain things might show up or not. So what would make sense is we need to now probably style the suggestions component so it looks a little bit nicer. So for example, maybe text align this left, give some more padding between these things. All right, so if I search for A, I get back all these. So let's just go ahead and go here. And we need to be able to style every individual item. So let's add a class to these suggestion divs, and I'll say class name is equal to suggestion. And going back to my style sheet, I want to style the suggestion, and I want to say text aligned as left. And then I want to say padding top maybe 4 pixels, padding bottom is 4 pixels. Okay. Padding left of maybe 10 pixels. Okay, that looks better. And then what we could probably also do is when you hover over them, notice that the cursor is not changing, so we can make cursor a pointer. And we also want to make it so the entire row, when you hover over it, is maybe given a background color of a gray. Okay. So that already looks a little bit more realistic, right? That looks like the Google search suggestions. And one thing you'll notice is that the height, no matter how many things we get back, it's kind of hard coded. So that's not really that nice. So I'm going to go over here. Instead of saying height of 200, I'm going to say max height of 200. And now as I search for things that give me smaller suggestions, it's going to reduce the height of that. And I do think that this should have some default padding top of maybe 20 pixels and bottom of 20 pixels. So it looks, okay, that's a little bit too much. Let me do 10 pixels. All right, so how does that look? That looks pretty good. So we've made some good progress. One thing you'll notice is that this suggestion thing always displays. So even if we haven't typed anything, it's always displaying a list of all the suggestions, which isn't really ideal. Okay, so what we want to do is dynamically show this or hide this based on if we have any suggestions to display. So I'm going to make a helper function called hasSuggestions, and that is just going to return suggestions if the length is greater than 0. And I can use that to dynamically show the suggestions div. So I'm going to do hasSuggestions, call it, and if it is true, we are going to render this out. hasSuggestions is not a function. Oops, let me do this. You know, since I think this is recomputed every time, you don't even have to do a function call. So let's just try that. And that seems like it works. So when the page initially loads, notice that there is no suggestions component showing, but as I type in A, it'll display because of this line that we added. Now, another thing you'll notice is as I clear this out, it's still showing. So we want to basically check if you set the search field equal to an empty string, we probably want to clear out the suggestions. So at this point, it's probably a good idea to refactor this out to a function. So I'm going to say search field changed and make that a function. So search field changed is a function. Make sure I can spell that right. And that is going to basically do the exact same thing as before. And so we'll just verify. Let me move this down here. Sorry, I'm kind of jumping all around right now, but I'll move this down here. And I want to verify that everything works as it did before. And it does. So at this point, if the value, I'm just going to pull that out to a variable so that we don't have duplicate stuff going on. So I'm saying if the value is equal to an empty string, do something. Otherwise, we can do that. In fact, I think we always want to set it. So let's just do this. So if it's equal to empty string, we want to clear the suggestion. So how would you do that? Well, we could say set suggestions of an empty array. All right, so now if I backspace, notice that the suggestion things goes away. All right, so we're almost pretty much close to the end here. There's two things that we need to do now. If we click on the oranges, if you click on one of these suggestions, we kind of want to set the input box to be whatever you clicked. So we could add a click listener to this suggestion div itself. So on click, suggestion clicked. We'll go ahead and say that we called suggestion. And let's go ahead and make this an anonymous function. So it's complaining because we haven't created this function yet. So I'm going to go ahead and create that. And what we want to do is if you clicked on a suggestion, we just want to set the input box to what we clicked. And then we want to clear the suggestions out. So I will do that suggestion is equal to an empty array. So let's see if this works. If I click on oranges, it doesn't do what we want. And I think it's not doing that because we haven't set a value for the input. So if I go over here and say value is equal to search field, that should hopefully update as I click on one of these suggestions. So if I do like apples and click that, notice that it went ahead and set my search field. The other thing that you'll notice is that it didn't clear out the suggestions. And we are also getting a warning down here, which we can fix in a second. But so I think the issue with this auto-populating and doing another suggestion search is due to this effect, right? So whenever search field changes, it's going to go ahead and do a search. So what we need to do is kind of prevent it from doing a search the next time you click on this. So what we could do, this, I don't know if this is kind of hacky, but we could say, we'll make a new state called, we'll set equal to false, and we'll say skip suggestion search. And then, of course, we'll have the setter here. So I'll say set skip suggestion search. And if this is true, we want to return and not do a suggestion search. All right, so what we could do here is when you do a suggestions click, we just basically set this to true. And then when you type, I'm going to set it to false. So I hope this works. I haven't really tried this before. So we click oranges and notice that it doesn't show the suggestions. If I keep typing in, it should work. Let's see, grapes. Cool. All right, so there you have it. This approach is a little bit, I don't want to say tricky or hacky. You could probably just not use an effect and just manually do suggestion searches as someone types in. But this is one potential solution, and I'm open to feedback if you have suggestions as a better way to do this. This seems kind of hacky, the skip suggestion search, but it works. And at the end of the day, as long as the search component is working fine, then you should be good to go. One thing we didn't do is if you click on the search thing, it doesn't actually do anything, which is probably cool because that's going to be the parent component that's kind of initializing this would probably have some type of callback. So just to kind of explain what I'm talking about, on your search button, so I'll say on click, you probably want to do some type of on search call, which will be passed in as props. So up here, I could say this takes in a on search property, and then whenever someone tries to search, I could just do a console log, and that will be the term. So I'll just do that and make sure that inside of the suggestion component, whenever you try to do a search, I'm going to go ahead and just pass in a parameter for whatever the search field is. So what is search field? Okay, so now if this works correctly, if I click search, it's going to call the property that was passed in here on search, which will go up to a higher level parent component, and I can do whatever I want with whatever was typed into the input box. So, alrighty, well that wraps up this tutorial. If you enjoyed watching this tutorial, be sure to give me a thumbs up and leave some comments. And if you're new to this channel, be sure to subscribe for more videos like this in the future. If you thought this was a good tutorial video to explain React and the various concepts that are involved with becoming a React developer. Alright, thank you so much again. This is a Web Dev Junkie video. My name is Cody Seibert, and have a good day.